Hello, everyone, and welcome to another great episode of Hive Live. I'm your host, Alex Netty, and joining me today are my co hosts, Andrew Bradley and Corey Neske. Hopefully, you've been following all of our great, approachable cybersecurity content on social media. But if you haven't, you can find us on all of the major social channels. Just search for @Hive Systems. So make sure to give us a follow. Today, we're talking about a topic that if you haven't encountered it yet, you will soon. It is third-party risk questionnaires. Many companies are now using risk questionnaires to assess whether your cybersecurity is up to snuff to be able to work with them. The goal of these questionnaires is to protect the company's data, but also the data of their customers. If you're going to be working with them, they're entrusting that data to you. The problem is a lot of these questionnaires are complex and long. And even worse, every company has a different questionnaire and styled that might get delivered through a different tool. So, how can you, as a potential vendor to multiple companies, better manage these questionnaires? And are there right and wrong answers? And could you lose the opportunity to work with these companies based on your answers? Well, today we're going to be talking about all of that and more with Corey and Andrew. Welcome, guys.
Morning.
All right, let's dive into it. This has been a hot topic with some of our clients that we've been working with. Third-party risk questionnaires, cybersecurity risk questionnaires, whatever they are called. At a high level, for those who are not familiar with this concept yet, what are they and why are they important for the companies that are giving them out?
Why should we trust you with our data? It comes down to you want to know that they're at least as secure as you, or if they're making new data for you that is particularly sensitive, you want to know that your data is going to be protected. So, and also from a purely regulatory perspective, which probably drives a lot of motivation to do this, it is, did we do our due diligence to ensure that whoever we're entrusting with our data is compliant with the same things that our customers expect us to be compliant with, or our members, or our even our employees.
Yeah, good point. Andrew, what do you think?
No, yeah, that's absolutely. I mean, that's nailed it right there. It's basically an exercise in due diligence that companies have to do to understand how their data is being protected and the security controls in place around them. Otherwise, you don't have really any assurance. And also, when it comes down to contractual obligations between you and your customer, or your customer and you, there is a certain amount of verification, I guess, that goes on for a lot of the contractual clauses that include security terms and security addendums, that those questionnaires kind of help facilitate as well. So there's the practical aspect of it of performing due diligence, and then there's the the realized aspect of it where people are actually testing you against the things that you said you responded to within a questionnaire. So yeah, it gives assurance to anybody looking into your environment that what you're saying you're doing is actually happening.
I think that's a great point. I think one of the ways that we generally see this too is it's something we see from a little bit more mature companies, not necessarily larger companies, but ones that are more mature in their security life cycle. Oftentimes, we'll see all of this from a third-party risk perspective just be managed through contracts. So language for you working with the company, you'll just be contractually held to cybersecurity standards, which of course could have legal ramifications if something goes wrong, but there's no due diligence. And so that's where these questionnaires fit in, is a little bit later in that maturity life cycle. Companies not only want to hold you contractually obligated to managing those standards or cybersecurity requirements, but they want to know more about your environment so that they're comfortable sharing their information with you.
Yep. And I guess a lot of times you have an organization that's larger or a little bit more mature. This could be a precursor to their further assessment efforts. So based on your responses, could trigger one of their vendor audits or their third party risk management audits or assessments. So a lot of companies use it kind of as that entry gate for that process as well.
Who are companies, I guess, that are generally targeted by risk questionnaires? Is there any difference? Is it everybody, or are all companies held equal? How does that generally look from that perspective? Andrew, I'll let you answer first.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. Most organizations take a risk-based approach and really follow the data. So they're not going to put every single vendor that or third party that they do business with, like a janitorial service or facility service that doesn't have access to data or access to sensitive information. They may not put them through that same level of diligence process. This is mostly going to be for IT and software as a service, infrastructure as a service, your cloud service providers, those types of platforms that are handling data, managing data, storing data on your behalf, or your own company's sensitive information. Those are the ones that are generally going to be put through these questionnaire processes and due diligence processes. They're not touching data. They don't have access to systems. They don't have access to your sensitive information. They're probably not worth the time or the resources from the organization perspective to put them through this rigorous due diligence process.
Yeah, Corey, what about you?
Anywhere the data is regulated. So
Yep.
I think finance started really putting pressure on it so that even if you have somebody who remotes into your environment temporarily, you want to make sure that that device that is remoting in to do even IT support is protected and that they're compliant and that they have been trained to understand the sensitivity of the data and how they're expected to protect it. Same thing with healthcare. More and more we're outsourcing services because it's more cost effective. You can outsource a specific function to somebody or a company that is much better at processing that information. So the organizations that end up having to spend a lot of time on this end up being everybody. But I think traditionally it's been finance, healthcare, federal contracts, anything where there's an outside entity saying, we know it may not be a big risk to the company if you lose this data, but it's a big risk to the people that the data came from, whether it be financial, healthcare, secrets of any kind for defense.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of growth in this realm because of things that are happening in the news. There's SolarWinds. There's a lot of third-party risk, a lot of supply chain risk entering the equation now, where people weren't thinking about these things previously. And yes, of course, compliance plays a role in that. A lot of compliance frameworks and compliance standards require you to have a third-party risk management process and due diligence process. But as the regulators' eyes are opening to these breaches, as whether they're public sector or private sector, we're seeing kind of the evolution of requirements on even smaller businesses kind of shift and take on this burden of third-party risk management that didn't exist before. And it's a good practice. It really is, like, for your organizational perspective. If you don't know where your data is going and how it's being secured, at least that from like a very high level, these questionnaires offer like a high level view. They're not going to give you very detailed information, but they'll give you some assurance, and that's better than none, obviously. And before, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, a lot of companies had no assurances over where their data was and where it was going and how it was being protected, other than what was in either contractual statements or was pushed down from regulatory burdens. So yeah, it's been like a pretty shifting landscape and growing area for companies and organizations, especially in the private sector. Public sector's always had due diligence processes. They haven't always been the best, but they've gotten better lately. But private sector has always been an area that lagged a little bit behind in that arena. But like Corey said, financial industry, healthcare, those two have had these in place for quite a while, and now it's kind of spreading beyond those two industries to other industry.
Yeah, and
I think that's a good point
Sorry.
too there, because one of the core ideas here when we're talking about these data types and companies at risk, we might be thinking of IT and lots of information transferred. But a good example I remember from some past experience was there was a small business that had won a contract with a very much larger company, and it was just actually to print addresses on envelopes to send out mailers. And as a result, that information that small mom and pop shop was processing was the most sensitive information type, personally identifiable information. So name, address, phone number, the real goods of information. And so from that perspective, they fell into that realm of needing to answer that risk questionnaire, but how they were going to secure and manage that data. And so they were presented with this third-party questionnaire, but had never really thought about cybersecurity. They just said, we're just a place that's printing envelopes. Yeah, you're just printing envelopes, but the information that's being printed on there is the most sensitive information that this company holds and processes. So, what does that mean for them, and how can they better manage it?
That might actually be a good segue to the burden of questionnaires on organizations.
Let's talk about the burden of questionnaires. So all of these questionnaires are different, which is hard. All of the questionnaires are generally long. Cybersecurity is a far-reaching set of things that we try to do to make systems secure. looking at large frameworks like NIST or ISO, or even requirements from things like SOC or otherwise, all feed into this. And so when you generate a bunch of questions to try to get the assurance that somebody's doing security right, it can end up being 500, 1,000 questions long, and every company has a slightly different take on those questions. How on earth, if you are that small mom and pop shop that's printing envelopes, how do you handle this? How do you kind of manage and answer these, and what are some good approaches?
I think if you have one questionnaire that you have from a potential customer or client, that is a good place to start. But to store those responses and think about the fact that the questions are going to probably be similar. So the first thing that comes to mind is how many organizations just try to answer the questions as if they're only going to happen once, and kind of do a custom process for every single client. And then they're like, oh, this is too overwhelming. And it's like, well, if you just kind of make the question, your responses generic enough that they can answer multiple questionnaires, you're going to save a lot of time. There are automated tools and templates to help with this, but we might get into those today.
Yeah, for smaller organizations, it's always a challenge, especially as you're trying to scale up. As you're scaling up people, you're scaling up business and sales, and you're scaling up users of your information systems, and maybe even customers. You have to start thinking about security, right? You should probably start thinking about security early on, but as we know, startups don't usually think about it security as like one of the primary objectives. It usually comes a little bit later, grows a little bit later. So as you're kind of working your way up and scaling up, you have to start thinking about some of these things. And to be quite honest, like, security questionnaires are generally based on the compliance requirements of the entities you're doing business with. So if you're doing business with Microsoft, they've got a host of regulatory considerations that they have to bake into their questionnaire. So they have a very robust and large security questionnaire process, and that actually is actually beneficial to you, because you can kind of see where you should start focusing some of your efforts in your own security program, and it may lead you down the rabbit hole of establishing a framework, right? So you kind of find a framework that meets some of the requirements in those questionnaires, and then you start building out a security program from there as a smaller company, right? You start off doing what you can to answer questionnaires of your customers. As those questionnaires evolve, then you started looking for like a standardized framework that you can apply to yourself, so that the answers you're giving back to everybody, all questionnaires, are going to be the same. And in the process of doing that, you may also elect to like identify a questionnaire that you want to complete, kind of like as a preemptive approach. So like a SIG or a CAIQ, you can store one in-house, and when people reach out to you for their security questionnaire, you can either generate it from your GRC system, or you can provide them the completed SIG or the completed CAIQ that you've already completed. And we can talk about what those SIG and CAIQ things are a little bit more as well.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into some of these
Yeah.
questionnaire types, but you're exactly right. I think for the most part, for these questionnaires, they're generally based around the same principles that we think of from the world of cybersecurity. And so generally, while the questions might be slightly different, your answers are probably the same. And so oftentimes, if you answer one questionnaire, I'd like to say you can answer them all. That's probably not always true, as some are going to be more verbose than others, but generally the concepts are the same. How do you manage access control? Are you encrypting data? How do you prevent data loss, that sort of thing? And so kind of thinking through your answers are a key part and consideration. That of course takes us really to that next question there, which is the big one. Are there right and wrong answers to these questionnaires? Obviously these are not audits necessarily where you might receive regulatory fines, but I suppose the trade-off is that if you answer these questions insufficiently and it's part of an evaluation process for a company, you might not win that work. So are there right and wrong answers, and what are some ways to maybe position yourself better to answer them correctly?
Yeah, if only security was black and white, right? Like
Yeah.
everything had a right or wrong answer. Obviously, organizations are going to answer with the controls. Hopefully, they answer truthfully with the controls that are actually applied and applicable to their environment, and they're not, making stuff up on the fly. That would be the worst case scenario, because then you could get, called on it and then audited by your customer, or audited by a third party on behalf of your customer, and then you've got some explaining to do. So you should always answer truthfully, even if you know the back end requirement that your customer is looking for and you don't meet it. Answer truthfully, and then they'll either in their review, they'll make a risk assessment of that non-compliance or that non-conforming control, and then they'll either pass it on to you as remediation action or a requirement. There's very few things in my experience that constitute showstoppers in these processes. Now, a lot of companies, when they're engaging smaller businesses, like, they know what they're going to get in return from this. They know smaller businesses are not going to have some of the industrial and mature security processes that big corporations have. So they're able to adjust their scale as well, as of expectations, and they can also implement additional steps to mitigate those risks. Forcing you to use their laptops or their information systems only. You can't use any of yours. But there's ways around your own failures of those controls, or failure to meet the requirements of those controls. So it should always be truthful, and work with the customer, to identify a path forward if you don't meet a certain control standard. But yeah, you should never state anything in a security questionnaire that isn't true, because you should always assume that somebody's going to come and verify it.
Corey?
Very little to add to that. I think that's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah.
But black and white, there's no black and white. It's what you're doing in your environment at that point in time.
Yeah. What does come to mind, though, is that I've definitely noticed that if you set up expectations in your questionnaire responses, that there'll be even just like 3 bullets for every response. If you have 2 bullets anywhere, so little silly things like this. If you have one question where you only put 2 bullets, people are going to try to think of a question to ask you to feel like they're putting in the effort. So when you answer questions, answer them in a uniform way. Like if you're making 3 points for each one, make 3 points for each one. Don't, because otherwise it sticks out, and people might realistically have this concept that if in the future there's a breach that has to do with this vendor, that auditors are going to look at this questionnaire and they're going to say, there's this hole in the questionnaire. There's only 2 bullets in this under this question. Why didn't you ask for more information? I don't know if that's actually a reasonable fear, but I definitely see that happening. So if you want to avoid unnecessary extra work, make a good technical document.
Or at least, yeah, follow-ups, right? If you answer all of the questions as they're asked, and sometimes those questions are multi-parts, right? They might say, are you encrypting data, and is it encrypted at rest, and is it encrypted in transit, and is your most sensitive data encrypted, and what kind of encryption do you use? Yeah, do I love that it's all rammed into one question? No, it probably should be broken up into multiple parts if you want all of those parts answered. But yeah, do yourself a favor and answer it as much as you can, so that there's no follow-up to say, well, you only answered part of this question, not all of the question.
That brings up a good point. So you should always answer as completely as possible with the information you're comfortable sharing. So there's obviously some questionnaires dig so deep that they get into very sensitive information like configurations, and you may not want to share those specifically over with the customer, but you can have a dialogue with them to say, well, we can provide you a screen share, or we can provide you a secure transfer of a baseline configuration or something like that, or a standard or something like that to appease the question, but without oversharing information, especially if you don't know how they're handling that information on their back end and their third-party questionnaire system, maybe, and you have questions over like the custody. So there's you should always be complete, but I would also encourage you to kind of take your own risk-based approach to the questions and the information you're sharing as well, because if you don't want to let too much sensitive information out there for a potential attacker, if that information gets compromised, then
I think what you described, Alex, it reminded me of, that happens a lot, where you get a really long question, like a paragraph long question. So when you're writing questions, I would recommend not doing that, because they're just going to answer one question probably in that paragraph. So if you have a paragraph that has like 6 different questions all compounded into one sentence, they're just going to answer one and try to get away with not providing a response a lot of the time. And that's not because they're lazy, but because what happens a lot of the time is they're going to paste that into a spreadsheet or into a database, and they're going to distribute those questions to the relevant parties. So the engineers answer the 2 first questions in your paragraph, and then compliance answers the next 2. And so that makes that process much more costly to the people answering the questions. So do keep them separate. If you keep your questions simple, concise, you're more likely to get an answer that's satisfactory.
Yeah. that, and if you're on the other side, if you're the people completing the questionnaire, if you don't understand a question or the context around a question, you have to ask, right? You have to ask a follow-up question to the people giving you that assessment or that questionnaire. I know like you'll get a lot of pushback from your sales folks, especially if it's an 11th hour deal and you're trying to close and it's waiting on security for you to complete this questionnaire and then for security to sign, accept the addendum terms, all those things. You can't let that kind of push you to providing bad responses or no responses, because it only comes back to bite you later on. As much as sales is important, representing your security environment is just as important to your customer, because otherwise there could be contractual issues with that later on, especially if something were to happen like a breach or an incident.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to add in, leverage the salesperson, and the way that you can do that a lot of the time is, if possible, don't sign the contract until the questions are answered, because as soon as you sign the contract, you don't have the salesperson as a champion to get the due diligence complete.
Yep. And vice versa. You shouldn't, if you're the company doing the due diligence, you shouldn't sign a contract until the vendor or third party has completed that questionnaire, because once it's signed, there's not really much you can do unless it's baked into contract language that you have the ability to kind of revoke or terminate based on some of the responses later on.
Yeah.
So it's good to do it up front either way.
That does actually take us to a good question here. We'll talk through some example questions in a minute, but what does constitute a good answer to a question? Offhand, one I think the main ways is when answering questions, we think about ultimately the questions are based on security controls and ultimately based around reducing risk. And when we think about activities that can reduce risk, they can either be manual or they can be technical in nature. So I think one of the main ways that I always like to answer questions is to say it doesn't have to be a tool or some automated process. It might just be something that you do day in and day out, whether it's a manual check or tracking something. It doesn't have to be fancy in order to reduce the risk of whatever that question is asking. I will say too, a response that is a bad answer is saying something like, "We're a small business and we trust everybody here." That's not going to be a good enough answer for a large company that's asking that, and you'll immediately get pushback. So those are some good and bad options. Corey, what are some good and bad answers?
Just responding yes to a question that's not a yes question. That's surprisingly
unless the questionnaire only asks you yes or no.
True.
We do the cybers.
Yes.
Do you have a policy? Yes.
Links to content that they don't have access to.
Right.
Attach
It's
it.
frustrating.
Or actually give them access.
Well, yeah, what should you do as a small business? Obviously, you want to be a good partner in this process for sure. But if the question is, do you have a cybersecurity policy? Should you share it right off the bat? Or can you just answer yes because they didn't ask for it?
Never. So this is counterintuitive, but never offer more than they're asked, because there are contract implications, right? So if they only ask you if you have a policy, say yes. They can ask later on for you to provide it. When I used to issue questionnaires for my previous job, we had a questionnaire that literally asked, "Do you have an information security policy?" If they clicked yes, there was a second question that popped up, or was shown that said, "Can you please attach a copy of your information security policy?" Now, a lot of places don't like to share their information security policy because sometimes it has some sensitive information in it. So some people will just share a table of contents, and you kind of have to get comfort over the controls they might have in place. But that's where the rest of the questionnaire kind of helps out, fill in the gaps.
Yeah,
actually,
I think it's going to depend on industry too. Like sometimes it's a very clear expectation and you're just going to see it. You're going to get asked over and over and over again, we need a copy. In which case, either way, you're going to end up forming a due diligence package that you can just give to them right away, to say, answer all these questions, or from you're on the other end, here's a bunch of the stuff that we usually provide or that we usually ask.
Yeah, I'd say an example of a good answer is one that gives your customer comfort, or your potential customer comfort, that their data is secure and that control is in place, and then it's not a facade, but it doesn't necessarily get to the level of technical detail where it puts you at risk. So you don't have to worry about backing yourself into a corner by saying you're doing a specific configuration or a specific setting at a certain level. You don't want to do that either. So you want to give yourself the flexibility of responding in a way that doesn't back you into those corners where now you're required to meet this thing you've committed to continuously or until the next questionnaire. Most companies will do an annual reassessment or an annual due diligence exercise, but if they have the facilities to do it. But yeah, it's the difference between a good and a bad answer is really in the context of the question and the person reviewing it. That's unfortunately you're beholden to the people that are reviewing those answers, and if they want more details, they're going to ask you for them.
Yeah. A trend in information security policies also has just been to have them up as a public website. So it won't be the same maybe as your internal one, but what you could do is have, if you see, especially startups, they'll have a link somewhere on the page that says are just security or compliance and security, and it's this page that just describes a lot of the things you typically see in information security policy. So that is kind of a good exercise because there are certifications like SOC that will require you to have that anyway. So to have something that is public facing where you're thinking about, okay, this is public, what do I want to include and not include, kind of satisfies both situations. So having a customer facing document kit or having them actually on the website can be a much more sustainable way to answer that question with a link, our website /security policy.
That's a good point. Does, for these companies that have pursued certifications like SOC reports or ISO or any of those other ones, does that absolve you from having to answer these questionnaires?
Not usually. In my experience, it's not like if you have a SOC report or you have an ISO certificate or like a PCI DSS AOC, it's not usually enough to deter the questionnaire. There are some cases where you might be able to negotiate. So if you could provide the PCI DSS, the ROC, which is a little bit more detailed and describes the controls in a little bit better, somebody may take something like that. Or if you have the actual SOC report, which companies don't like to share the full report, including the control detail, the control descriptions, and the weaknesses, that may be enough. But in my experience, customers generally want to run you through their questionnaire anyway, and they like to do that for two reasons: because they're going to request a lot of that information anyway, and then they're going to do a cross check. They're going to see what your answers look like versus what's in either the SOC report or the PCI or the ROC or in any SSP or anything like that you provide. Now, when somebody's coming to you and saying, hey, we got to put you through our third-party risk assessment process, you can always offer to give them an SSP, your policies and procedures right off the bat. If you have a completed SIG or a completed CIIQ or a questionnaire you've done previously that has all the answers, and it's pretty recent, you can offer those up in lieu of having to do their questionnaire. They may accept it. It's never hurts to ask if you can give them something to reduce the burden on you, and it'll also reduce the burden on them of having to wait for you to provide answers and then go through it. If they can get it up front, they may just go through it all and be like, we're comfortable with this. We've got enough assurances. So that's always something you can ask up front as well.
That's a good point. There's a little bit of a dance that ends up happening between who's the bigger company, right? Because sometimes you may say, we have this questionnaire we want you to answer. And if the company that's going to be working with you is a little bit bigger, they may say, here's our questionnaire answers that we've done before, deal with it. And so you as potentially the smaller company might have to deal with it.
Right,
and
like
versa.
an Amazon or a Microsoft, they're not gonna sit there unless you're a big dollar contract and do your questionnaire. They're gonna send you over to their compliance pages in their portals and let you download a SOC 3 or a SOC 2, and that's your comfort level.
Yeah, probably a little bit
just kind of how it
negotiating
is.
for who's bigger on the
exactly.
Who's got the better questionnaire or who's got the time and wants to deal with it. Yeah, the Amazons of the world aren't going to answer your bespoke questionnaire if you're asking them. And vice versa, if you try to maybe offer Amazon some questionnaire answers you've previously done, they might say, tough, you still need to do our specific questionnaire because we have a specific process. And unfortunately, you may just need to do it. That's a good point. That does take us over to some good questionnaire types, and we talked about this a little bit earlier. So there are a number of ways of doing questionnaires. In fact, we could sit here and create one on this chat right now and kind of hit all the main points of cybersecurity. But what are some existing questionnaires that exist out there? What are some common ones that people might see?
Well, the two we already talked about, there's the SIG and the CAIQ. The SIG is a industry standard control set. It comes in two forms. There's a full version of the SIG, which is a lot of questions. I can't remember the total count of the questions, but it's a bear. And then there's a light version of that.
1,000 or...
Yeah, it's like 400 or 500, I think, is the full SIG, and then the SIG Lite. There's a light version of it, which is it's a lot less. I think it's like 100 or 150 questions maximum. But those are two of the biggest industry checklists that are or questionnaires that are used today. And the CIIQ is the Cloud Security Alliance is kind of very similar. It's very similar in scope and depth as the SIG. It's just a little bit more cloud security focused, cloud provider focused. So you'll see companies that may ask you to complete one or more of those. A lot of companies will have one or more of those completed. If you're doing your due diligence, they may ask to provide you one of those. But those are the two biggest ones I have encountered. Corey, I don't know. Have you seen any additional ones?
No. Google has a tool that has like a responsive vendor questionnaire that I can't remember the name of. The SAQ.
Yeah, I know Microsoft has one as well.
You can
and actually a very a lighter set of questionnaires actually, and something we haven't even talked about here that we see occasionally that's not based on anything are third-party risk questionnaires associated with cybersecurity insurance. So if you go through that process, sometimes you may encounter very similarly questions that ask, do you process PII? How many records of it do you process? Do you have network controls? So very similar in this case to potentially get a quote for cyber insurance, or even in some cases, general operations insurance for your business or small business as well. Corey, we have seen a lot of those for sure.
You're talking about the insurance providers doing questionnaires?
Yeah, giving questionnaires out to people seeking insurance and answering, I guess, to ultimately assess their risk. Not as long as the SIG and maybe not as comprehensive, but some specific risk vectors that they're focused on, obviously, to identify those loss events and how much to ultimately charge you for your premium.
Yeah, I was going to say that's also a common question on these. It's actually a question on the SIG as well. Is do you have cyber insurance? And then the what do you call it? Any riders, incident and breach riders, and things like that.
We do an entire Hive Live about cyber insurance, so we will not delve down that path today. Corey, any other common questionnaires that you've seen from a third-party risk questionnaire perspective?
Questionnaires, no, but I've definitely seen companies be okay with just getting a third-party independent security assessment that aligns with a standard of some kind. So instead of answering a ton of questions, you can say, Hive Systems has certified us in SOC 2 or PCI DSS or whatever, and that might be sufficient for them. It seems to be more the case in finance. I don't know why it hasn't grown to other areas. I think a lot of people just don't realize the questions are answered in the like a SOC assessment. Like all of your questions were looked at by a third party, so why are we answering the questions again?
Yeah, and it's not like you're doing a full audit either, right? So like you're not, if you don't trust that the third party assessor did their job necessarily, like you're not going to be able to validate that they didn't do that because you're not doing a full audit. You're only asking, this is only a questionnaire, right? So I'm with you, Corey. When we used to do this, when I worked for my previous employer, we would take a SOC 2 PCI DSS 3.2 assessment of the ROC, or we would take any of the NIST assessments, the FISMA or FedRAMP packages, and we were comfortable with those because it's kind of duplicative to make somebody go through and do a questionnaire after they've already done this with a certified third-party assessor.
Yeah, and it's worth it just to send the company that's sending you the questionnaire that certificate and say, are we good? And they might say, oh yeah, that's fine. We just always send the questionnaire with this. So it's like you might end up wasting a lot of effort. So it's always good to send that and be like, is this sufficient?
That also does bring up a new industry that's starting to pop up too. These ideas of basically third-party questionnaire brokers, where companies will subscribe to these kind of clearinghouses. The clearinghouse will conduct the questionnaire, manage all of the answers, and then as a company, if they engage with a new one, they can point to the clearinghouse and say, we've been cleared through this company. I don't know if this is going to take off or not. A lot of companies like to manage their own risk and not rely on a third party to manage their third party risk, because that sounds like a bad version of Inception. I don't know if you guys have heard about these or encountered any of them.
Yeah, I've encountered too many of them, in fact, because so on the other side of the aisle, when I used to be answering the questionnaires and doing this work, the most annoying thing is having to manage credentials myself to 6 other systems that our customers have provided us to provide responses in.
Yeah.
Constantly monitoring them when they're asking for additional information, because they like to use their system that they've paid for. So alerts and things like that come through there. So you have to monitor it, and you've got to provide information to these systems where, to be quite honest, like I don't know what their data security standard is. So if I'm uploading artifacts that they're requesting, our security policies, architecture diagrams, things of that nature, I don't know how secure it is. So I don't
Yeah,
like
it's a
to
real
use a lot of
Spider-Man
these.
pointing at Spider-Man
Right.
situation there, right?
Right. So I feel like I have to do a security assessment of them before I can complete their security assessment. So, I think it puts a lot of unnecessary burden on potential vendors to have to use multiple systems. I know there's a lot of convergence on some singular solutions. I won't name any because I don't know if we're allowed to do that, but there are some systems out there that are more common than others, and a lot of them have started to integrate like centralized identity management and single sign-on capabilities supporting your own organization, which presents other challenges as well because there's an engineering piece component of that. But they're getting a little bit better. But when I was doing it, I did not like the fact that I had to manage 6 sets of credentials to 6 different systems, answering the same questionnaire in 6 different systems. But it is what it is. You want to win the work, you got to do the work. So
Yeah.
Yeah. And if there's a special, because it's a generic questionnaire, so if there's like a special situation between you and this or other or third party, they might not answer it. So now what you have to do is go through all those questions and see, does this answer my question? And if it doesn't, you have to ask another one and kind of keep it separate.
right.
So you end up having to go through a lot of the work anyway. I think there's a lot of inefficiency with vendor management, in that it would be ideal if, and like less wasteful, if both sides would take a risk-based approach. That's my bias. Is like, just do an assessment of what data are we sending this vendor? Okay, what kind of controls actually matter to us? Because like they can give you a cloud certification, but it's like, are you using their cloud product? No. Then you're just wasting time.
Yeah.
So if you have the resources, and it doesn't take that much really, doing a risk-based approach to asking questions will cause both sides to get a refined set of what questions really matter and what bits of information do most of, if you're a service provider, are most of our clients caring to, what do they care about?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I think for people that are trying to set up a third-party risk assessment program or a vendor compliance program, that's something you should probably really take to heart, is understand the types of vendors you're dealing with, the types of data they're getting or securing, and really the risk associated with them. It's probably beneficial to kind of run through and create separate questionnaires or types of questionnaires based on risk or based on the type of vendor. You're not going to give an infrastructure as a service company, you shouldn't give them the same questionnaire that you're giving to a software as a service company. There should be more of the controls are inherited from an infrastructure provider than from a software, or vice versa. But you should like scope it out based on the type of vendor and the data they're getting. And Corey, I like totally agree with you. Like nothing is worse than like having to answer a questionnaire that's asking me about physical security when we're a SaaS provider, and all of our physical security is provided by AWS or Google.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
As we get close to the end here, let's look at some questions here or some sample questions from some questionnaires. What I'm gonna do is I'll ask the question. Let's break it down and talk about what that question is really asking. What is the company trying to assert by asking that question, or rather assess? And then ultimately, how would we kind of look at it and answer it? So this is a common one we see all the time, where they say, do you have a disaster recovery or a business continuity plan? And do you regularly test it? So what is the company trying to get to here? What are they trying to suss out in terms of a risk? And how can you best answer this question? Corey, I'll let you go first.
They're either looking for the kind of disaster where there's massive flooding and the data center just everything shuts down because incidentally, or because they want you to see if you're prepared for kind of the inevitable breach or big outage that happens regardless of your controls. Because if you have a good incident response plan, they at least know that even if your controls are terrible, you're prepared to you're prepared to react and minimize the fallout of a data breach or an outage. So I would say what they're looking for is, did you think about what would happen if something went wrong? And are you prepared to respond? And have you practiced before? Or have you had an event before where you were able to test it out? Because it's, we do disaster recovery, business continuity planning, documentation, but also the exercises where you do a simulation of a loss event. And there's always there's always a broken link somewhere where somebody doesn't know who to call, or they're like, oh, wait, we don't have internet access in this loss scenario. So what do we do? And nobody knows what to do. So the exercises are great to find those things. And customers want to know that you've already thought about it, because if you're relying on them for a service, they want to make sure it's available. And you
Yeah,
as a
that is the
customer,
key piece in this, right? Cybersecurity is about protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. If I'm a company and I'm relying on that third party for whatever service they're providing, I want to know it's still going to be around because I'm counting on them being around to help us from a
Yeah.
business perspective. So yeah, I think that's the root of this question is it's really about protecting the availability of that service. Some of these other questions we'll talk about here are around the confidentiality or integrity.
Yeah, and a lot of good security program analysts or associates will look at that and they'll tie together your business continuity plan, your DR plan, your testing of it, and they'll also tie that back to the SLAs you've agreed to or you are agreeing to in the statement of work, and look to see if what you're proposing as the SLA of 99.8% availability of the application is feasible given your business continuity program or your disaster recovery program. If you've never tested it, how would you know that you can meet that SLA?
Mhm.
Things like our recovery time objective and recovery point objective are probably going to be questions later on in that list, and then they're going to look to see that you've got those established, and they're going to come back and say, well, you've never, if you say no to that first question, you don't have a BCP, you don't have a disaster recovery plan, you've never tested it. How can you provide us assurance that these RTOs and RPOs are actually something you can meet? And
Mhm.
then based on that, how are you saying you can actually meet this SLA that you've agreed to? So that's kind of like the web of connectivity between the controls and some of the statements of work.
I think it's
Yeah,
the most modest, like the most modest cybersecurity control too, is just like, we can't prevent everything 100%.
Right.
So
Yep.
are we prepared? It's kind of like if you're going to do anything, that's what you need to make sure you have set up.
Yep.
I think that's a key idea here with all these questions is always try to get to the root cause of what that company is trying to understand. What are they
Yep.
trying to reduce the risk of in asking the question and getting an answer from you as a potential customer? So, from an answer perspective, right, answer it in a way that talks about how you're going to protect the business. So, even if you're just that mom and pop shop that are printing envelopes, you need a business continuity plan if your printing warehouse is unavailable or all of your printers get ransomware. What's your backup plan for continuing to print those envelopes and those mailers? That larger company is counting
Yeah.
on you to do that. So you should have thought this through. And if you haven't, right, for that company, that's a risk. Maybe they don't want to use you because you haven't thought through how you're going to continue to do your operation and really just that business perspective of what you're doing as a business. That's a risk to them. Again, it comes back in this case to the availability of
Right.
that information and you providing that service.
Yeah, and like if you're the mom and pop printing shop, right? Like if you say you don't have any redundancy because you're a mom and pop printing shop, you're tiny, like the risks of somebody attacking you with ransomware doesn't seem that that profitable or that likely for your business specifically. You can convey that to your customer, and your customer can look at like what they're using you for. If they're using you to print envelopes, right? Like what is their availability requirement for you? Obviously, if they can't print some envelopes, it's whatever their max tolerable downtime for that specific business process is. they may be comfortable with the fact that you can't get stood back up in a day or two, or you got to go
Yeah,
buy
right.
printers and
It might
stand
be okay
up.
for you to
Yeah,
say we don't have a plan.
yeah,
And so if we're
exactly.
down for a day and we can't print envelopes for that bigger company, might not be a problem. If you're down for
And
a couple
that's
weeks,
yep.
might still not be a problem. If you're
And
down
that's that
for a
risk-based.
year, right? That's a
Yep.
different question.
It's that risk-based approach that Corey was talking about before, right? So you're conveying your own assessment of the risk to yourself. Well, we're a printing shop. Like it's not that important to us because if we go down, we can't print envelopes. Like, what does that mean in the grand scheme of things? To the customer, you have that open dialogue. What's the risk to you? Okay, we can't print envelopes. We can't send out these mailers to our, I don't know, these political figures who need to get this mail in 3 days. Like they should be assessing the risk to them and then letting you know if that's acceptable. And in some cases it may be, their risk tolerance may and risk appetite may support that you don't have a BRD or a BC or DR plan.
That is a key point to all this, Andrew. And a great point is that sometimes it is a little bit about telling and selling your answer, right? Why is my answer to this maybe not what you're expecting? Ideally, right? If you're a larger company answering this, you say, yeah, we have a business continuity plan and we do it by each business and we annually assess it and we review it with leadership down through the departments and we test our disaster recovery plan with failover exercises and everything else 4 times a year because that's what we want to do. But if you're a mom and pop shop, right, you could say we don't do any of that because the risk is lower. We're just printing
Yeah.
envelopes and we will go buy new printers if our other ones get locked with ransomware and be back up and running in a few days. It'll be uncomfortable, but we'll make it happen. You can tell that narrative and hopefully from the business's perspective, that larger company that sent you this questionnaire, they can justify it and say, yeah, from a risk-based perspective, we're okay with that answer because you're not critical. Now, if it's AWS says, yeah, we don't have any fire suppression in our data centers because they'll never catch fire, then yeah, you might be a little less uncomfortable or more uncomfortable with that because there could be a fire. And if they're not planning for one, then that's probably something a company might evaluate a little bit closer.
And I'd
Yeah.
hope a company would do a little bit of critical thinking on whether they need to actually issue a risk questionnaire to mom and pop printing shop if it's like a 2-man operation, but we'll see.
And I'll be
Yeah.
perfectly honest, I've seen too where cost is a factor in all this too, right? If you're trying to evaluate between, Amazon and the AWS data centers and Bob's budget hosting, if Bob's budget hosting is 1/1000th of the cost of AWS, and the trade-off is that Amazon has data centers with huge fences and guards with guns versus Bob's budget hosting, which is in his mom's basement with a dog, for a business, they might be saying, you know what, the cost is worth it. We can't afford the bigger data center. And so we're willing to accept the risk that hopefully the dog barks and stops an intruder from getting in and stealing the servers. I think that fits into that risk-based approach as well. Corey, I know you love dollars assigned to risks.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's cost benefit analysis, a more sophisticated cost benefit analysis. What it reminded me of is this ties into contracts. If you're a regulated entity, if you're a hospital, if you're a healthcare provider, or in finance, you probably have to have in your you'll be audited for in your contracts with vendors. Does it have an SLA like as part of the agreement? Because they provide you hosting like Amazon, or because maybe you just outsource the data center management or the sysadmin, like the people that manage your servers or whatever. If you're outsourcing that, you might have to actually have a contract that says we agree to bring things back within 24 hours.
For sure.
And at some level, for some companies, they expect you to actually audit that and check, have them demonstrate that. So even if you are a mom and pop shop and you're outsourcing those services, you might be able to do incredibly. Nowadays, you can do huge work. Like you can be an international mom and pop shop
Yeah.
and do a lot of business because you're leveraging these third-party tools. But you still have to do that. You have to have that due diligence step where you get that Amazon to sign. We have a 24-hour response time, and if we don't, you get money back, or we have a plan, so on.
Yeah, that's always what the contract redlining process is for, right? So when companies put their security addendums or some of those requirements like backup and recovery timeframes, that's where you go in and you review the contract language and you bring your red highlighter and your red pen and you start negotiating process with the legal parties and the security people and the privacy people, and you start talking about what's realistic and not realistic. And a lot of that gets reflected in there before the questionnaire could even comes to you. And so when they get the questionnaire responses back, there's no surprises.
Yep. Let's do one more quick rapid fire question here. Do you conduct routine access level reviews? What is this question really asking, and why is it important for a company to be asking this, and how can you answer it? Andrew, I'll let you take a first cut.
Yeah, so the initial, the impetus behind that question is that they're looking to see, for people that have access to their data in your system, or to information in your system, or access to the service that's being provided to them, people who could potentially shut it down and impact availability. They're looking to verify that you guys are performing some sort of review of their privileges and access rights, and making sure that only the people that need that access have that access. So least that principle, least privilege. That's a pretty common requirement across security frameworks and across compliance requirements. It's rigorous for small companies, because you're getting stood up. A lot of people have access to a lot of things, and you may not have a mature role-based access program yet. But again, that's something you just want to be honest about, and let the customer determine whether that risk is acceptable to them.
Yeah. Corey, anything to add to that?
My analogy for this is, people say that if you want to lose weight, don't have the food in the fridge. And that's like the best way to
It's the only way that works for me.
a very effective way to like make it inconvenient. That's kind of what this is about, is there's a little bit of risk that comes with everybody who has access. And then the more access they have, the more surface area there is, the more opportunity there is for loss. So this is just a matter of going through and just saying, even if it's a quick 30-minute call with your management, and say, these people in your departments have access to our core database. Do they still need access? And this person says, no, these 3 people don't anymore because they transferred, this person left the company or whatever. You really quickly can prune those off, and those probability of those becoming an event go to 0 very rapidly.
And this is a great example of a control, right? That there's all kinds of expensive tools out there, like SailPoint, for example, that can help manage this automatically for lots of money. But it's as simple as getting on a call and going, hey, let's check our G Suite access. Let's check who's still in Slack. Let's check who still has access to QuickBooks, and just run through those systems and make sure there's no outstanding people. You may find, and likely will find, some people who have the wrong permissions, or even people who've left the company or transferred, or a contractor who came in and assisted for 6 months and left. Those are risks to the company that you're going to be working with, and they just want to know that you're reviewing the data at some set frequency.
Yeah, and everybody wants to see a nice, pretty automated solution there, where you've got your identity system hooked into your access management system, and your privilege and authorization system, and it's all up to date, updated automatically. When somebody transfers in a unit, you update their business role, you transfers their unit, transfers their access. But it never works quite as simple as that. People are always trying to.
We work with Fortune 200 clients that don't even have that done right still, and they have all the money in the world to throw at the problem. So
so if you got to do it manually, that's fine. Define your roles, define your access privileges, your data assets, and then what people should have access to. Define it, and then review it, and just do it manually for the time being, and then that'll set you a better foundation for later on when you want to move into the automated tools.
Yeah, it also keeps management in the right mindset when they're trying to add people. If you don't have a little bit of like a penalty or a cost of like giving people access, just give everybody access.
Right. Yeah.
But if you force management to have to look at a packet that says these 40 people in your department, or these 3 people have access, they need to go through it every month and say like, no, yes. If it'll give them a little bit of an intuition of how much risk is being taken by their departments, and to help them just keep that in mind when they request access.
Yeah, and there's always, no matter how well you define access rights and privilege requirements, there's always somebody that needs a little bit more access, or somebody who needs a little bit less access than they're granted, and it's by nature of the work they're doing, or temporary scenarios, and it's just the way it is. But it's a little bit, we got a little bit into the control itself there, but I think the answer is basically just that they're just looking to verify that who has access to their data, to the service, and that you review it to make sure it's appropriate.
Corey and Andrew, this has been fun. Hopefully for those of you watching, you've kind of seen behind that this isn't a dark art. There's no specific way to do this right or wrong, but there are some ways to identify those questions, read behind what they're actually asking, and then answer them appropriately. From our side, that is all the time we have for today. We want to thank you for joining us to learn more about third-party risk questionnaires. As always, our experts here at Hive Systems can help make your cybersecurity journey more approachable. So reach out if you ever have any questions or you're having trouble with your own third-party questionnaires, whether answering them or establishing them for your company. Before we go, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you can be alerted for our next event by going to www.hivesystems.io/HiveLive. Next month, we're going to be talking about another exciting topic from the world of cybersecurity. So make sure you don't miss it by, again, subscribing to our channel at www.hivesystems.io/HiveLive. Until next time, remember, when it comes to cybersecurity, you need to act and not react. Thanks for joining us.